as Hannah was very happy to say, every startup goes through this arduous task of raising money, telling investors it will last 18 months, and then 6 months later, coming back for some more money. Taking a quick step back, I'd like to accomplish a few things with this panel. I'd like to try and define why public and a lot of our partners are so excited about this market. One of the main things about GovTech is it's very broad. And I think we often do it an injustice by thinking it's just at a municipal level, at a local level. GovTech, for me, and I guess we can ask people and we'll find out more from our panelists who I'll introduce shortly, is very broad. It's health tech, it's agricultural technology, it's police technology, it's welfare technology. It is basically any technology that sits between the state and the citizen. And any technology that sits between the state and the citizen can be improved in our view. And so we're delighted that so many startups have come today, and we're now going to try and explain a little bit about how we can oil this industry with the cash and the support it needs. So sitting next to me are a number of very, very prominent investors, people who've had experience inside government, outside government, backing companies, not enough companies that have sold to government, and we're going to try and cover a broad range of subjects, and at the end of it, hopefully get an understanding of how both government and the venture capital space can work together to drive to fuel further innovation in startups. So very briefly, I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll get straight into the questions. On my left, firstly, is Marie Ekeland. She's a partner at Daphni, which is a VC here in France, and she's also the former president of the French Digital Council. Then we have Brent Hoberman, founder of many things. Most recently, Firstminute, another venture capital firm in the UK, but formerly also founder of lastminute.com, and also lots of things called Founders, Founders Fund, Founders Factory, Founders Forum. Then we have Christian Mandl, who's sitting here with two hats, one as an investor in non-government technology businesses and one as an investor in government technology businesses. So we'll press him about which opportunities he's more excited about. Ron Bouganim, I title him as the first person to put his neck on the line and raise a dedicated GovTech fund and call it the GovTech Fund. And then finally, James Wise, who's a partner at a leading UK VC, Balderton. So I guess maybe quickly, starting with this inflection point. I think maybe those of you who've been here all day, I think this market is at a point in time where it's ready for the fuel, it's ready for venture capitalists and governments to unleash cash and to deliver the innovation and support the innovation we so greatly need. I think we'll go quickly around the panel, and starting with you, Brent, maybe because you've been around a bit longer than some of the other people on this panel, sorry. Brent saw the internet happen. So, Brent, maybe if you wouldn't mind walking us through some opportunities which you've seen where markets have suddenly shifted and rapidly changed from an area where you wouldn't put a penny of your hard-earned money into a market such as fintech, for example, where everyone is piling in. I feel GovTech is getting to that point, but maybe walk us through some of the views you've seen in the past.
Yeah, I guess so. Thank you. So I guess some of those catalysts for change. So I guess if you go back to online travel, which at the time you have to remember, all the traditional players said it would never be more than like 5 or 10% of the market. People really didn't believe it. One of the things I think changed that time, and people don't really recognize it or remember it, was actually, weirdly, it was the low-cost carriers, those airlines, EasyJet and Ryanair, who said, if you want to buy a ticket, you basically have to be online, or you pay this massive premium. And I think there's a sort of parallel for GovTech. Obviously, you've probably been talking today about sort of Denmark and Estonia, where for online identity, you sort of have to do it if you want your benefits. So I think that's one of the things. I think the other one is talent and ecosystems and all those sort of things, which come up a lot today. But if you mentioned fintech, so I guess you've got to go back to sort of these sort of PayPal-like mafias. So obviously, we all know about the PayPal mafia and just how powerful they were for what they went on to do. And I think that's also created these ecosystems of entrepreneurs who go back into sectors and just drive it, just as the Skype mafia in Europe has done a tremendous amount. But you see these industry change. Real estate's another one, where you just say, the sort of Zooplas and all these Seloger.com here, and they hit a critical mass where basically they get so customer friendly that the need and the deal is worth the hassle. And then what's happening now is the hassle is so much less. At the time, back in my day, it used to be, it had to be worth spending like 5 minutes finding your credit card and putting it out. Now it's all this one-click payment stuff. It's so much easier. So the deal maybe has to be a little less dramatic. But I think it is then about, And the other thing then is about proof points. So we have a little company called Luther System that does blockchain. And what happens there is, once they get a pilot, I think the easiest way to get to GovTech is to go via corporates first. So in Luther Systems' case, it's sort of smart contracts type stuff. You get the pilots with the Avivas of this world. You then get the reference clients. That's still incredibly hard, but it's less hard than getting one with the government land registry, for example. So once you've got that, you are authentic and validated. And what we need to get as a zeitgeist moment is where it's no longer that person you can never get fired for choosing IBM, which it used to be. It's if you're in the government, you should always be fired for not choosing startups.
Very good. Quickly to Ron, maybe, because you're potentially backing the next PayPal mafia group of founders. You've raised a number of funds towards investing purely in people who are looking to build business into GovTech. Maybe reflecting on your views of where this industry is.
So I think the industry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I think the industry now has reached a critical point in its evolution. I think a conference like this, for example, was not even possible just 2 or 3 years ago. Today we have 1,500 attendees, and credit to the public team for doing such a wonderful job. I think maybe I'll plug another public. Today there was a release of the GovTech report that you put out with Accenture. I think if you look at that report, it's really well done. It speaks to the major waves that have crashed now into government. And so it's things like cloud computing, it's budget constraints. You have a whole new wave of younger generation coming into government that are digital natives themselves. And so they're looking for these technologies. You have the citizen themselves using smartphones every day and expecting these kinds of services. So these are large meta multi-decade trends, and they've all coalesced now, and they're literally crashing into governments, and they're recognizing that there's no such thing as policy without technology anymore. In the US a number of years ago, the Obama administration launched healthcare.gov. It was the end of the long 30-year cycle to get healthcare for everybody in the US. Wonderful process. They launched the website, and it fails miserably. And so they had to spend tons of money and tons of time. And the policy, after all of that debate, literally almost failed because of technology. So again, as an example, it's one of those things where I think governments now realize that this is integral into what they do every day. And you just see a coalescing of capital coming into the market, startups coming into the market. It's why we were able to raise our first fund in 2014, and now we've raised our second fund just a few months ago. And there's many more to still come.
Great. Maybe Marie, just coming back across the Atlantic, Ron speaking from experience, especially in the US, as the former president of the French Digital Council and as an investor in GovTech, civic tech businesses, are you feeling that same shift over here?
Yeah. What's actually funny is that people are investing in GovTech without knowing they're doing GovTech. So this is actually what we did at Daphni, because when we set up our investment strategy, we were trying to understand if there was some specific European DNA in the society, because digital economy is an economy of usage. So you're basically transforming the societies and reaching out directly to consumers. So if you want to have a good product market fit, you need to understand them. And basically in Europe, what we found is there was 2 very big pillars. One was collectiveness, is that you can see it in the quality of the infrastructures, like it be telecom, energy, transportation, or in the fact that sharing economy is a lot more used in Europe than anywhere else, or that when we think about education or insurance, we think very inclusively for everybody. So we've been investing in companies that are actually improving all these sectors, and we've been investing in GovTech without knowing it, and I believe a lot of people are doing exactly the same thing.
Interesting, thank you. Maybe that's very positive. I just want to push James, because he said before that I could ask him, why aren't you doing more in GovTech at Balderton?
It's a great question. I think it's actually a problem for the ecosystem as a whole, is that we're seeing so much more momentum in entrepreneurs coming out of the civil service for the first time, starting businesses. We're seeing a lot of momentum in government, where they're trying to open up, they're trying to change the way that they procure and work with startups. But actually, venture capitalists are pretty uninnovative. I mean, we're still financiers for the most part. Those people who weren't financiers probably worked in startups in an era where they were cynical about government, where they saw government as slow and difficult. And so what we're lacking really is investors who are sitting on the boards of these companies, who've got experience of working with government, who are passionate about challenging some of these issues, and who really believe it's possible. And I think one of the final pieces of the ecosystem that does need to change, as Ron's leading on and as others like Daphni are doing so as well, is bringing in people into venture funds who really understand how to work with government and are excited about the opportunity.
That's interesting. And Christian, maybe you straddle both. A fund dedicated to traditional investment, perhaps, and then one focused with technology for good, civic tech, GovTech. But you've made a number of investments. You've got eyes on how both portfolios are doing. Is one doing better than the other?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I think that venture capital is actually adapted to GovTech and civic tech because, many public administrations try to buy softwares from large companies for millions of dollars, and I think the way startup works is they try to focus on an app that does something well and that is really focused on something. So everything that looks like a Swiss Army knife that is trying to address everything to everyone is not anymore. I mean, now you take Slack for one thing and you take another application for something else. And so I think typically in a venture capital portfolio, you invest in 10 companies and 2 companies are successful and pay for the others that are less successful. So I think the venture capital is really the right way because in Europe, we typically have a way still where you would need to create a consortium where you would put 3 universities together from different countries and that doesn't really work because people become professionals in just presenting applications for grants. So I think venture capital is really adapted to see the emergence of the successful GovTech companies. Where there are still challenges is obviously first for GovTech funds to get the limited partners, the investors. It's still not easy to get investors dedicated to that. Then for the companies themselves, it's actually quite difficult to find the right business model. Because if it's a business model based on advertising, like pay-per-click, then it's really promoting fake news. So if you really want to have something that is based on facts and figures, you need probably to have some membership fee or other types of business model. And then finally, for the fund itself, we typically invest in order to exit. And what is the exit path or the exit strategy of a civic tech company? Could you actually imagine one day a public administration, the government, buying a civic tech startup? Why not? They prefer to spend $10 million on a contract with a large vendor instead of buying startups. So we need also this type of exit paths in order to have the whole cycle of venture capital from the investment up to the exit.
Thank you. Ron, maybe quickly back to you then. I mean, you must have a pipeline of GovTech companies applying, knocking on your door every day, given that you've called yourself the GovTech Fund. What some parameters of companies that really are good? What makes a good GovTech company, in your opinion? What gets through IC?
I'm sorry,
what gets through your investor committee?
Through investor committee. So I would say actually the answer to that question is maybe going to sound a little bit generic to startups and maybe to venture capitalists, which is to say, I think GovTech startups are competing for capital in the same way that every other startup is. And so from our perspective, you need to have a very clear definition of the problem. We have a lot of companies that pitch us and they're saying, oh, I'm having a real challenge with procurement. And when you get into it, the details, it's actually that the product is not solving a major problem. So of course, why would anyone procure it? So defining the problem, do you understand the customer? We call it the ride-along. So we have a company in the law enforcement space. They literally did 1,000 rides inside police officers' vehicles to understand the workflow. So do you understand the customer? Is there a velocity to your business? So our target is within 3 to 4 years of our investment, you're doing 25 million of annual recurring revenue. So it's 2 million a month. That's roughly 15 to 17% per month growth. We have a number of companies in that zone, and the reason we look for that velocity is because, again, you're competing for capital. And so you need to be able to do that to the point of exits. You need to be able to demonstrate that kind of path. Otherwise, you don't become interesting from an exit perspective, an acquisition or an IPO or something. So that's another part of it. I think what is kind of unique to GovTech maybe that's a little different than a typical VC, we do look for, where it's applicable, this sort of network or marketplace effect. So it turns out that GovTech startups in our portfolio, yes, they're building technology to modernize a specific agency or process, but they don't just live in a bubble, nor does government. So what they're doing is they're serving the government, but they are also looking at serving the stakeholders. So for example, in the law enforcement investment, yes, you're helping to manage police departments. Are you also connecting with the community? Can you, in the case of procurement, yes, you're selling into a procurement officer who is in charge of buying for an agency. Are you also connected to the vendors, right? So in a number of our companies, you create this marketplace dynamic, and that's unique, I think, for the GovTech space, because government is unique in the way it interacts with all the stakeholders.
Great. And again, just picking up on that last sentence, I mean, the way government interacts with stakeholders. Marie, Brent, I just think, what can government do, actually, more? We've talked about it, we've covered it in many panels, but what can government do for the venture capital community, maybe, at least to make us get more excited about investing in GovTech companies?
Well, I guess they could cornerstone a pan-European GovTech fund. I mean, it may be better than, I'd probably believe in that more than the EIF putting more money into venture funds, because I actually don't think that's the problem. And I think it is, one of the issues is fragmentation. I think that is one of the hardest things. If you're trying to, I pity people as GovTech startups trying to sell to so many different types of people across Europe, and without any urgency to buy. That's the other thing. The commercial world, there sort of is an urgency to do it. In the sort of GovTech world, you can put it off forever. I guess, to me, it's then about, it's the talent pipeline. How do you get the most amazing people to want to be GovTech entrepreneurs? And we saw this in a slightly different way when we were funding social entrepreneurs. And no offense, but many of the projects we funded, we thought that they weren't just good enough. We weren't making enough of an impact. And I think it then gets to the fact that success breeds success. One of the reasons why we won't be getting the best entrepreneurs going after GovTech startups is because there aren't these billion-dollar exits. So it's a sort of circular reference. So how do you break out and get them?
That's interesting. If I can react, I think a lot of the engineering talent and entrepreneurial talent that we are seeing coming into our market in GovTech and the companies that have applied to GovStart are often second-time founders. And so you don't need to be spectacularly insane sometimes to solve government problems. You need to be smart, architecturally savvy, and passionate about making a change, a fundamental societal change, as opposed to a new e-commerce platform, a new, something different. And that's why I think actually we get some very interesting talent through the door, willing to work for less and to do more. So it would be interesting to see how that plays out, but certainly in terms of the applications to companies, when they say what they're trying to do, we do get some very interesting people, second-time, third-time founders, especially in the engineering side, who have seen some of the inefficiencies or have perceived inefficiencies inside government and decide to, say, I can make a difference. So that's just one of my immediate sort of thoughts there. Marie, maybe on your side.
Yeah, I think there's apart from the investment perspective, there's two other important perspectives. The first one is that government is a buyer, and so and they should actually, a country that has digitalized its state, its government, shows the way to the whole other industries, and so it's very important that there's a strong strategy and investment in acting as its own transformation, and this needs to be done at two levels. The first one is local, because if you want a lot of initiative, because nobody knows what it is to be a digital state, right? And what we see with this new digital world is that there's a lot more premium in local communities and the power that they do have, and a lot of empowerment that needs to be done at that level. So I believe there should be more freedom of buying and experimenting at the local level for government that are truly wanting to digitalize themselves, and afterwards a transmission to the national level and seeing what is working at local level, what should be spread to the rest of the country. So I think that's very important in my perspective, is they're not only an actor in investing in the field, they're an actor in becoming a true actor of transformation, and that should start from the local level. Yeah, if you want to rebound, because, okay, there's another dimension for me that is truly important, is that GovTech are usually very regulated sectors. And for startups, it's a risk, and for investors, it's a risk, because you need to be secure in how the regulation is going to be in the next years, and usually when you're innovative in that sector, you need to change regulation. And And that is a role that governments need to play. One, in hearing the voice of startups in what should be changed, because usually they only hear the voice of incumbents because they're used to doing that, and startups do not have the time. They're focused on their business. They're not focused on changing regulations. So really putting the effort on understanding what and how regulation should improve to make the whole sector better is super important, and they should do it at national level, but regulations need to be changed at international level. And so that way of going local, national on the buying sector and transformation sector, and from national to international on the regulation sector is super important.
So I could just bring that back to fintech, because that was actually going, if we look back, that was one of the reasons why these fintech startups have succeeded, is because actually the startups have an unfair regulatory advantage. They are not regulated like the big banks. And so if we look at many tech companies have succeeded so well because they have a regulatory advantage. And actually you could go back to Amazon and the current debate about Amazon's tax and sales tax and all that sort of stuff as once again a regulatory loophole that has been found. So I think we need to find the GovTech startup regulatory loophole or sandbox.
No, that's right. I like the idea of getting smart on the government side and sort of acting as a exemplar, and then pushing that through the institution that it is okay. Christian, sure.
Yeah, Brent mentioned the low-cost airline, so I actually happened to found a low-cost airline, and one of the benefits of the low-cost airlines that if you got a license in one EU country, you could fly in the entire European Union. And at the moment, if you look at procurement, you have, for example, the UK that has a digital marketplace, which is great, but you don't have a European digital marketplace, which basically means that you still have to sell to 27 or 28 countries. And most of the civic tech startups are local. And we as investors, we need scalability. So we need also to see how they can also sell outside of their borders. So I think that's still one of the challenges, how to actually have this concept that if you are approved in one country, you are automatically approved in the other countries.
Yeah, a passport, yeah. James, just quickly to you, I know you spent a little bit of time as a special advisor inside government as well, so now with both hats on, what would you have done inside government that would have helped you in your role now outside of government?
Yeah, so I'm quite fortunate, and I got so frustrated being a specialist advisor and then working in social enterprise that I went into technology only to find it just as frustrating in this sector. I think one of the big things I think we've already touched on is giving power to the local users, giving power to the civil servants who are actually using these tools, ultimately to be your test bed to move up to a national level. When I think about two of the most successful companies I absolutely love in the GovTech field, ClassDojo, which provides in-classroom feedback for teachers, and Sophia Genetics, which is a genomics platform for bioinformaticians, the reason why they've managed to spread to thousands and tens of thousands of government bodies is because it's the teacher in the classroom or the bioinformatician in the hospital who got to choose that technology initially, and then when it gained traction, then they go in at a local or national level to build support for it. But in order for that to work and for VCs to get behind government companies taking that approach, government has to empower local people and the users at the end of the day, whoever they be in whichever department, to make those purchasing decisions, which is a difficult thing to get right. But once you do, you can see exponential growth like those two companies are seeing.
Let me just add a quick data point, just because we've talked about local. So I think I mentioned we have 20 companies in the GovTech Fund portfolio. Collectively, we are today in 20,000 agencies in the US. We're adding about 10 a day as a portfolio. 96% of them are local municipal. In the last 18 months, we've seen counties in the US, which is kind of in between state. And then the last year, we've seen the states starting to get on board. We think that's going to take another 2 or 3 years to mature. Interestingly, a lot of the federal, in the United States, a lot of the federal level government gets all the attention about innovation. Actually, they're quite behind. And so it's been very interesting to us that the GovTech revolution has been bottom up, and I think that's actually quite encouraging.
And it's just to react there, I mean, Europe in that sense is quite an interesting place for American companies to come to. You have over 18,000 police forces in the US. The UK has 43. So, we don't have, 1,000 times less people than you. And so if you could sell 43 times, you cover the UK market. In that sense, we're quite central in Europe generally. I mean, there are exceptions, but even our large federalized countries are large states. It's a much more interesting sort of central market here at the moment, although I really do appreciate that bottom-up journey that you're on is quite powerful too. Sorry, James.
Yeah, just on that, I think that as a VC, one of the #1 pieces of advice I give to people who are working in this space is to focus on getting the first 10, 100, or even 1,000 users before going after that one big contract. Because it's so much more appealing to hear someone saying, you know, there's 100 local doctors I've convinced to use this, even if you know that it doesn't naturally scale because of regulation, versus I'm going after the whole of the NHS and I've got one chance at hitting it. I think it's far better to hear sort of the scrappy startup approach in the pitch from the bottom-up approach.
You also need a lot more data points, right? So if you have those data points, then the company can iterate much quicker than the one big deal.
I just want to, picking up on stories, I love stories. If we can just go down let's go down the sofa this way because we've been down there. What's your favorite sector in GovTech and one of the most exciting companies you're working with at the moment or would like to work with?
Favorite sector? So my favorite sector is education, but I'm not going to talk about a company that I could talk about a company we've invested in, which is called Hoberman School, and which is actually training full stack engineer on a free model, but they're paid on salaries when they get out, and it's a 2-year program, but they found jobs at Tesla, Google, or whatever after 1 year. So, and it's they're focused on diversity, so excellence in education, but diversity, accessibility for everybody, and so they're very diverse. They have 55% people of color, it's Latinos, it's African Americans, Asian, etc. So, and what I like is that you're basically really shaping the future of the task force of the startups, basically, that are going to fuel the whole Silicon Valley for the moment, but they're opening a school in New Haven, and the idea is to spread the model elsewhere because there's no teacher, and they really package the whole curriculum and apprenticeship and the way they were doing that.
Great. So I guess I'll go to a company I angel invested in called Onfido, which is, again, going after identity. So I just think identity is so huge and so massive and so exciting and so hard for government to get their head around. And we've obviously talked about a few countries that have cracked it, but most are really struggling. And the UK obviously has its identity marketplace, but it hasn't yet got traction. So I think there are different models, and different startups will have a great chance there.
Well, what gets me excited is really the disruptive part of it, like disrupting democracy, using technology to invent new models of democracy. So I'm more looking at citizens' engagement and how, for example, blockchain can help to create liquid democracy type of concepts, or how you can also have self-sovereign identities and things like this. But that's probably the future. Some people are working on that. The company where I invested that has probably the highest potential is Apolitical, which is basically helping civil servants across the world to get access to best practices, because I think a lot of the government works in a very vertical way, and I think Apolitical is trying to create a horizontal communication. And I think it's really important to have inclusiveness, so that not only rich countries will have, you know, technologies for managing their governments, but that also the spirit of a kind of commons approach, that basically if Paris has a good participatory budget tool, why don't put this tool on an app store so that somebody else can reuse it?
So I'll answer the question, maybe 2 buckets. So the first bucket would be maybe the areas where we get maybe the most number of pitches of companies, and I think that that would be procurement and law enforcement. And I think the reason for that is both of those are just immense. In the US, at least, there's $2 trillion of spend in procurement. So these are huge, huge spaces, lots of innovation. And then the other bucket I would say is maybe the less sexy things that people don't pay attention to, but we think we're very excited about. One is what you've been calling RegTech, which is regulation infrastructure. So there's lots and lots of regulations and laws underneath them that are connected to them. And of course, there's total disconnects. You have regulations for laws that have since expired. So all of the infrastructure of how regulations get made, how they're monitored, and so on is a big area. And then the other one, which again, maybe not that sexy, but in the world of just modernizing code. So it turns out that a lot of code sitting underneath these government agencies, and I'll speak about the US, is from the 70s. You have NASA, who's trying to launch space vehicles literally on COBOL. This is like nobody understands it. So the migration of all that code is not that sexy, but it's super important, and it turns out it's an enabler for so many of the other companies that are coming in. And if everyone's trying to sell into these agencies and they're all dealing with that old code, wouldn't it be better if the code was modernized first and then they can all, right, so that's an enabler. I do have to give a shout out to our first European GovTech investment, Forward Health, and we're just huge fans of the intersection of health and government. Health administration is a massive space, and we just think that's a wonderful company. That's why we made the investment.
Yeah, and carrying on that theme, I think I'd also add health. I think health is one of the most interesting areas. It crosses borders, and yet it's regulated nationally. So you have this incredibly interesting problem where the data that you collect from each individual matters to them and can be submitted to a pool to help people everywhere. But you have to adapt to each local system and each local level of regulation. Makes it tricky, but if you get it right, I think it's incredibly rewarding. So Sophia Genetics, which I mentioned already, it uses data from 250,000 patients across the world to help improve diagnoses for everyone, but complies individually with each country regulation. Hard thing to do, amazing outcome when you get there.
Thank you. I did want to leave just a little bit of time for questions. If there are any questions in the audience, hands up. We'll have time for a few. Yes. Do you have a roving microphone?
Hi, I'm Shelley Taylor from Trellis, and I think it was Ron, I can't remember which one of you talked about the importance of the network effect in government, and I'm curious if any of you have any examples of the freemium model being used well in government. It's hard enough getting investment in the UK for, you know, any kind of a company, but then if freemium's quite difficult as well, but I'm very curious to know, since the network effect is really important in government, have you seen that model successfully used?
I can start with that. So actually, the freemium model hasn't really worked in government, and the reason for that is governments don't value free things, so you can literally not give it away. So we've tried to look at more of a sort of a minimum price point just to attach some value to it, and then we can work from there. And it's a sort of a land and expand model. I would say, however, that from a collaborative perspective, a full 50% of the bookings and the sales and the activity in the portfolio actually comes from governments referring other agencies. So it is literally every day. I've lost track of the number of conferences that are going on that governments put on for themselves, for their peers. And they come up with these crazy acronyms, finance officers of Western California whose names start with Tom. It's like so micro, but there's 20 people that show up, and they go and they talk about their innovations, and we love that. I mean, I think we're proud of what we're trying to do with the portfolio. And since government employees are not earning bonuses or stock options, this is a really important part of being able to demonstrate their accolades and what they've done on the innovation front. So the network effect is important from not necessarily from a freemium pricing perspective, but from building something that is good enough that someone really wants to show off what they've done. That pays dividends.
I mean, I certainly have exactly the same experience. Companies that we've advised, it's as hard to give something away for free as it is to ask for some money. For Forward, actually, though, one way you can go is to give civil servants things for free, and then what happens is you'll get a network effect. 30,000 doctors will be using a platform, and the CIO will knock on your door and say, hey, what's going on? Can I pay for this? That is a way that we're seeing freemium can work. Free to the user, but pay to the administrator of that user.
One way quickly, one little company we saw do that with EdTech, Manga High. Actually, they found that UK schools were so hard to sell to, they went off to Brazil, maybe for the weather, and to Australia, again for the weather. And they sold to Australian and Brazilian schools. And then once they'd proven it there, they then went back to the UK and said, actually, guys, now you've got to buy this.
Time for one more.
Yes. Hi, hello. I would like to know, as investors, what do you miss in the ecosystem to promote this GovTech market?
What do you miss in the ecosystem to promote the GovTech market?
Thanks. Well, I'd love to see some more experienced civil servants go into tech and investing. And this doesn't mean starting companies, but I think it does mean getting people to think about roles in startups and even perhaps putting in tours of service and saying, you know, if government wants to take this sector seriously, if they want to adapt both culturally to new ways of working as well as to new types of technology, then it would be good to start sharing talent more. They've done this historically in lots of different types of industries, and I'd love to see them do that more in the emerging tech sector.
Maybe one comment. I mean, it's very hard already to sell B2B enterprise software, but at least with enterprise software, you have some kind of expectations. What is a enterprise-grade solution? You know that you have to provide a service level agreement. So I actually don't know what is a government-grade solution. What the government expects from it's not defined.
I'd say, since we're nearing the end of the day, more events like this. And I think maybe within that, we've sort of alluded to it, but then at those events, maybe more matching, where you actually had real government buyers with startups really doing deals and making sure that it was end-to-end, that they could close the deals then and there. That would be amazing.
I think that's a brilliant way to end the discussion. More mixing, more interaction, more understanding each other's problems, and more delivery of better, profitable solutions that we can back. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.